let's go through the factor flow chart, because hopefully you've kind of started to use this a little bit, maybe, and kind of get in the hang of it a little bit, because you will be able to use it on Thursday when you guys take your test, and I promise you it can be useful to you if you know how to use it. So, just like always, you're always going to start here, you're going to check for greatest common factor. That will happen a couple times on your test, and you make sure you're checking for that. If there is factor out, if not, you're going to count the terms. Now, if there's 2 terms, remember, all of these are leading you to an answer that looks like this. All of these are leading you to put it into a FOILing problem. So what you're trying to factor is an FOIL. So, if you only have 2 terms, remember you just have the F, you just have the L. So it has to be a difference, and they have to be squares, because it has to be the same thing in the front of parentheses. It has to be the same thing in the back of the parentheses, and remember, you have to be adding in one subtracting the other. It tells you how to factor, guys. Look, a plus b, a minus b. Just read like x plus 4, x minus 4, x plus 5, x minus 5. Okay. And usually when you FOIL something out, usually we get the F, O, I, and the L. Right? The O and I combined together. Usually we get 3 terms. Now, if there's 3 terms, we talked about this a little bit on Thursday and Friday. You want to check if you can factor it like this, as the quantity squared, because that's so quick and easy to factor. It doesn't always work. How you're going to know if you can do this, there has to be a square in front, square in back. You'd have to be able to say, okay, to get the F, it'd have to be this times itself, and the L would be this times itself. And remember, when it says here, does the middle term equal 2 times A times B? That's just where we multiply those 2 numbers together, multiplied it by 2, remember the O and the I, and if it matched, we could go ahead and factor it. Okay? Now, if it doesn't work out, which I'll be honest with you, most of the time it doesn't. But if it does, it's super easy to factor, so I'm going to go that way. If it doesn't, then we want to see if it's x squared or ax squared. If it's just an x squared, go ahead and jump to your answer. Because if it's just x squared, you already know how to get the F. It's x times x. Okay? If it is an ax squared, like a 3x squared, the ax squared means airplane method. So you're going to draw your wings, which means you multiply to your propeller. Remember, you have to start, since it's a 3x squared for the airplane method, you have to start with 3x and 3x and then land your plane. Okay? Now, what we are going to look at today, this last type of factoring is here. When we count the number of terms, we're going to have 4 terms, which means when you FOILed something out, you have the F, O, I, L. Nothing combined together. Nothing. Okay? So like I said, this type of factoring, I would say for the most part, students catch on to pretty quickly, so we'll see. Okay, just like all of the other ones, factoring is the opposite of FOILing. So let's see what this is going to FOIL out to be, and then we can go back the other direction. So 4x plus 1 times 3x squared plus 5. So the F, 4x times 3x squared would be 12x cubed, right? X times x squared would be an x cubed. 4x times 5 would be 20x. The I, 1 times 3x squared would be 3x squared. And then the L, 1 times 5 would be 5. Now usually, most of the time, the O and I combine together. Problem. See the problem? They don't combine together. One's an x squared. This is an x cubed, that's an x squared, that's a constant. You can't combine any of these together. So they all have to stay separate. So technically, the best way to write your answer would be in standard form. So we'd leave the 12x cubed first, but I would want to write the plus 3x squared after that, and then the plus 20x, and then the plus 5 at the end. Okay, so here's how we're going to do factor by grouping, okay? It's pretty simple because you just kind of do the same thing twice, okay? Here's how you're going to do factor by grouping. The first thing we're always going to check for is the greatest common factor. Now there's 4 terms, so we have to check an extra second. So x cubed, x squared, x, 5x, and 10. They don't have anything in common. As soon as you see that there's 4 terms, there's only one way you can factor 4 terms, and that's by grouping. So in math, most of the time, grouping means parentheses. So step 2, we are going to group the first first two terms and the last two terms. What that means is you're going to put parentheses around the first two terms. Now, don't include that middle sign, but then you're going to group the last two terms. Okay, now, that first step we did, we checked for a greatest common factor between all of the terms, and there wasn't one. But if I, kind of in a way, break this up into two separate problems, that's going to change. If I look just at these first two terms that I grouped, x cubed and 2x squared, I want to factor out the greatest common factor from these terms. Okay, so x cubed and 2x squared, this is a 1x cubed and that's a 2 since it's a 1. There's no number that they have in common. But if I have x cubed and I have x squared, how many x's do they have in common? Remember, with the x's that they have in common, you want to take as many as you possibly can, but you have to take the same amount from both piles. Well, if I took 1, there's still some left, right? I can take 2. Right? And then you want to take as many as you can. I can take an x squared from here, so you want to factor out an x squared. Now, whenever you factor the greatest common factor, that goes in the front of your parentheses. You open a set of parentheses, and then inside you write what's left. So if you were to redistribute this x squared, what would be left? Or I think with the variables, what I like to think about, if it's an x cubed, when I factor out an x squared, it's like I had an x cubed, I factor out an x squared. It's like you're taking 2 of them away. You're just left with an x. Because if I redistribute this, x squared times x gives me x cubed. Okay? Here, I have 2x squared. I factored out the x squared. The only thing that's left is the minus 2. Okay? You're going to drop down that middle sign, and then you're going to do the same thing with the second group. Now, 5x and 10. What do 5x and 10 have in common? A 5. So we're going to factor out a 5. So you're going to write the 5 down. You're going to open a set of parentheses. Now, whenever you're factoring it out, a couple ways you can think about it. You can think about redistributing this 5, but what you get back, or when you factor out a 5, you're dividing each of those by 5. If that's what you would rather think about. So 5x divided by 5, you just be left with x. Negative 10 divided by 5, you get a minus 2. Okay, so far, we've grouped the parentheses and then factored out the greatest common factor from the 2 sets of parentheses. Okay, you guys with me so far? Now, if you do everything correct, once you get to this step, it looks more complicated than this, but you really just have 2 terms. Remember, terms are separated by addition and subtraction. So this right here is a term. X squared times x minus 2. Plus 5 times x minus 2. If you do everything correctly between these 2 terms, they should have something in common. So if you look at those 2 terms, what do they both have? What else? They both have that x minus 2. You see that? They both have that x minus 2. So what we're going to do, we're going to factor out the greatest common factor from the 2 groups. Really what you're going to do, you're going to write down what they have in common. They both have the x minus 2. Now you're saying, when you factor out the x minus 2, it kind of goes away. So we're going to open a set of parentheses and write what's left. So when I factor out the x minus 2, I have x squared plus 5. Now check. If you these ones are easy to check. If you were to FOIL this out, x times x squared is x cubed, x times 5 is 5x, negative 2 times x squared is negative 2x squared, negative 2 times 5 is negative 10. I know it's in a little bit of a different order because the 2x squared is out of place, but you get the same thing. Okay? It seems like a lot. Once you get the hang of this, this is definitely one of the easier methods of factoring. I think so. Okay? Alright, so let's get this glued into page 31. This should be section 8.8, and it is factor by grouping. Okay, number 1. First one, 8j cubed plus 4j squared plus 10j plus 5. Okay, so we are going to go through each one of these. We are going to go through that factor flowchart. So if you have it out in front of you and you kind of want to follow along, I promise you guys, the more you use them, the more you practice using them, the easier it's going to be on Thursday whenever you do get to use them on your test. So first thing I always want to check for is the greatest common factor. Since there's more terms, this step usually takes a little bit, just a half a second longer. There isn't a greatest common factor, so we're going to count the terms. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. You know, so your factor flow term, there's only one half. Once you go to 4 terms, it says factor by grouping. So we're going to group the first 2 terms, and we're going to group the second 2 terms. Now, when we do this, we do not want to include that middle sign, just the terms, okay? Now, although all 4 of them didn't have anything in common, if I separate them into smaller groups, 8j cubed and 4j squared, they do have something in common. So look at the 8 and the 4. What do 8 and 4 have in common? A 4. And then j cubed and j squared, how many j's do they have in common? 2, right? So I can factor out a 4j squared. So that's going to go in the front of the parentheses and then open a set of parentheses. Remember 2 ways you can think about this. You can either think, okay, if I redistribute the 4j squared, I need that back. Or if you like thinking about, okay, if I take 8j cubed divided by 4j squared, either way, okay? For the numbers, I think I like the multiplying part. 4 times what gives me 8? 2. Now I had j cubed, I factored out j squared. How many j's are left? So 2j. Now be careful here, this is the part that always gets students. 4j squared times what will give me 4j squared? 1. You have to have that 1 there. You have to have that 1 there. Okay? Okay, you're going to drop down that plus sign and do the same thing with the second set. So 10j and 5, what do they have in common? A 5, so we're going to write the 5 out front. 5 times what gives me 10j? 2j, and be careful here. 5 times what gives me 5? 1. You have to have that 1 there. Now there's one more step. What I have here is I have these 2 groups. 4j squared times 2j plus 1 plus 5 times 2j plus 1. What do these 2 groups have in common? The 2j plus 1. If you do this correctly, whatever in the parentheses should match every time. So then we're going to factor out a 2j plus 1. Just like here, how we factored out the 4j squared, we took out a 4j squared from both of those and wrote it out front. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're taking that 2j plus 1 and factoring it out. So when I factor out the 2j plus 1, I'm left with 4j squared plus 5. That's your answer right there. Notice, although this is like a totally different process than the other ones we did, something times something, this is a FOIL problem. Great. Okay. Let's try another one. Number 2. 2m cubed plus 8m squared plus 9m plus 36. Okay, we always want to start with the greatest common factor. 2m cubed, 8m squared, 9m, and 36. Do all of them have anything in common? I don't think so. Okay, so I have 4 terms. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to factor by grouping. So group the first 2, group the last 2. Looking at 2m cubed and 8m squared. 2 and 8, what do 2 and 8 have in common? 2, m cubed, m squared. What do they have in common? And m squared. Now, I had a 2m cubed. I factored out a 2m squared. What's left in that first term? Just an m. Excellent. I had an 8m squared. I factored out 2m squared. So 2 times what gives me 8? 4. And then I had m squared, but I factored out the m squared. So it's just the 4. Okay, I'm going to drop down the plus sign. 9m and 36, what do they have in common? A 9. I'm kind of thinking ahead here. If I did this correctly, I should get m plus 4 in here. 9 times what gives me 9m? And 9 times what gives me 36? See how it matches? Okay. Now, looking at these two groups, I kind of already pointed this out, but what do they have in common? M plus 4. When I factor out that m plus 4, what's left? 2m squared plus 9. What do you guys think? It's not too bad, right? Okay. All right, I've got a couple things to watch out for here. Okay, number 3. 8w cubed plus 6w squared minus 28w minus 21. Okay, first thing we want to check for greatest common factor. There isn't one. I have 4 terms. So we're going to group the first 2 terms, group the last 2 terms. Remember what I said, we do not want to include that middle sign in either one of our groups. Now looking at the first 2 terms, 8w cubed, 6w squared. What do they have in common? What do 8 and 6 have in common? A 2. And how many w's? 2. So we're going to factor out a 2w squared. 2w squared times 4w would give me 8w squared. And then 2w squared times 3. And I factored out all my w's. Okay, now here's where you're going to have like these big, huge red flashing sirens. I dropped down a minus sign. I'll explain why here in just a second. The other 2, I guess the other 3 that we've done, we've dropped down a plus sign. This is big, okay? We dropped down a minus sign. Same thing, okay? 28w, 21. What do they have in common? A 7. Okay, here's why this is big. When I open my set of parentheses, I'm not factoring out a 7. It's a negative 7. Huge! So, if I redistribute this, negative 7, I need that back. So the first term, not a big deal. Negative 7 times 4w gives me negative 28w. No problem there. But watch this. Negative 7 times what would give me negative 21? What kind of 3? It'd have to be a positive 3. It'd have to be. Also notice, if I hadn't changed that sign, those wouldn't have matched. Here's what you need to take from this. Anytime you drop down a minus sign, I guarantee it 100% of the time you're going to be changing that sign. Because when you distribute that negative number, it's going to change that sign. Okay? Now, once you change the sign, you can see that they do have that 4w plus 3 in common. And when I factor out the 4w plus 3, I'm left with 2w squared minus 7. Okay, that's going to be one of the biggest things that you have to watch out for. That's probably the most challenging thing to watch out for in factor by grouping. Okay, so just watch for that middle sign. Let's try to eliminate those. 21x cubed minus 28x squared minus 6x plus 8. Okay, so do I have a greatest common factor? No. Okay, I have 4 terms, so let's group the first 2, group the last 2. Remember, don't group that middle sign. Okay, 21x cubed, 28x squared. 21 and 28, what do they have in common? A 7, x cubed and x squared. X squared. So we're going to factor out a 7x squared. When I factor out a 7x squared, we should get 3x. And then right here would be a minus 4. Now, kind of thinking ahead. When I drop down a minus sign, I already kind of told you, I'm going to have to change that plus to a minus. I guarantee. Also notice, it has to match what's in there. It has to be a minus. And it makes sense. Okay, what do 6x and 8 have in common? 2, but remember I'm factoring out a negative 2, which is why we have to change that sign. So, negative 2 is going to have to be a 3x, gives me negative 6x. But -2 times a -4, so that'd have to be a negative anyway, is what's going to give me that positive 8. Okay, what do these two groups have in common? They both have the 3x minus 4. When I factor out the 3x minus 4, what's left? 7x squared minus 2. Okay, how do we feel about that one? Okay, so this is kind of like one of those game shows, or actually it's not a game show, it's like one of those commercials on like QVC where they're like, but wait, there's more! If you buy now, you can get a free cleaning solution for 5 easy payments of $15.99, right? Something like that, okay? That's kind of like, this is the section that just keeps on giving. There's more, okay? Let's try another one. So, number 5. Let's do 32k to the 4th minus 16k cubed plus 12k squared minus 6k. Okay, what's the first thing we always check for? Greatest common factor. We usually go to there's one. But! Is there a greatest common factor? It's at 16. What else do I have in common? A 2. See, they all have a k. The first thing you have to do, you have to factor out a 2k from all 4 of them, because all 4 of them have that 2k in common. So when I factor out a 2k, we're going to get 16k cubed minus 8k squared plus 6k minus 3. Okay, here's the thing. We did this a couple sections ago where we did the difference of squares and you had to factor the greatest common factor. Whatever your answer is, okay, it's going to be 2k times something times something. If you factor out a 2k at the beginning, your answer needs to have a 2k. What I would suggest you do, if you factor out a greatest common factor, write it where your answer is, and then just forget about it, because I promise you it's just going to get in the way. Because now what I have to do is I have to go back and look at these 4 terms. 4 terms, so we're going to do grouping. I'm going to group the first 2 terms, I'm going to group the last 2 terms. If you have that 2k there and keep carrying it down, it's just going to get in the way. Now this is the exact same thing we just did. 16k cubed and 8k squared. What do they have in common? 8k squared. And when I factor out 8k squared, we should get 2k minus, needs to be there. It has to be 1. Guys, you have to put that 1 there, okay? So we're going to drop down a plus sign. 6k and 3, what do they have in common? A 3. And when I factor out a 3, we should get 2k. Once again, you have to have that minus 1. Now, looking at these 2 groups, what do they have in common? They have that 2k minus 1. And when I factor out that 2k minus 1, I'm left with 8k squared plus 3. So your final answer is 2k times 2k minus 1 times 8k plus 3. Okay, let's try another one of those. Okay, number 6. 32m cubed plus 72m squared minus 80m minus 180. Okay, first thing we should always check for greatest common factor. Now these numbers are kind of big, and for consideration of time, it's a 4. They all have a 4 in common. Do they have anything else other than a 4 in common? Yeah, because that one doesn't have an n. So just a 4. So when I factor out a 4, we get 8m cubed. We get 18m squared minus 20m minus 45. Now remember what I said on the last one, okay? If you factor out a 4 in the beginning, your answer is going to have a 4 out front. So what I would recommend you do, go ahead and write what your answer is going to look like, write the 4 out front, and then let's just forget about the 4 so we don't have to worry about it anymore. Now we're going to group the first two terms, group the last two terms, not including that middle sign. 8m cubed and 18m squared, what do they have in common? 2, what else? M squared, 2m squared. So when I factor out 2m squared, we should get 4m plus 9. I drop down a minus sign. Remember what this deal, big deal is, right? Already thinking ahead here. What do 20m and 45 have in common? A 5, but I'm not factoring out 5, I'm factoring out a negative 5. So we are going to get 4m plus 9. And notice, both of these have a 4m plus 9 in common. Left with 2m squared minus 5. Okay, what do you guys think so far? Kind of fun, right? But wait! There's more! You guys are so excited. I can just see it in your eyes. You're just like glowing. This is so exciting. Okay, this is, I promise, the last layer of fun that I'm going to add. Okay? Alright, number 7. 2x to the 4th plus 6x cubed minus 8x squared minus 24x. First thing, greatest common factor. They all have a 2 and an x in common. So when I factor out a 2x, we should get x cubed plus 3x squared minus 4x minus 6. And just like the ones above, if we factor out a 2x, our answer should have a 2x. So go ahead and write that 2x where you're going to write your answer, and then let's forget about it. Yes? You are very correct. Yep. Let's change that to 12. Thank you for catching me now and not whenever I get confused by my answers not working out. Okay. So then same thing, we're going to factor by grouping. So group the first two, group the last two. X cubed and 3x squared. What do they have in common? 1. What do they have in common? X squared. Yep, they have an x squared in common. So I'd be left with x plus 3. I drop down a minus sign. Okay, trying to get your brain thinking here. 4x and 12, what do they have in common? It's a 4. So I factor out a negative 4. I'm left with x plus 3. So these two groups have an x plus 3 in common. And I'm left with x squared minus 4. And I know you guys were so excited and you're like, what's the other layer? I'm so excited to add something to it. This is the same thing as in the last problem. Here's where the other layer is. You're not done. This is not your answer. Because what you've done is you've kind of in a similar way, you've taken a fraction, 12 over 16, and you've reduced it to 6 over 8. You can reduce that again, right? You could reduce that down to 3 over 4. You can factor this again. I want you to look at this x squared minus 4. What times what gives you x squared? X times x. What times what gives you negative 4? And negative 2 and a positive 2. You can factor it again. So your answer is 2x times x plus 3 times x minus 2 times x plus 2. Is that not the most fun you've had all day? Yeah? Let's do one more. Like that. Okay, number 8. 8a to the 6th minus 8a to the 5th minus 72a squared plus 72a. Okay, first thing, we should check for a greatest common factor. These all have, let you know, they all have 8. They do have a 4, but bigger than that would be an 8 and an A in common. So when I factor out an 8A, we should get A to the 4, A to the 5th, minus A to the 4th, minus 9A plus 9. Now, just like the last one, and the 2 before that, you know your answer is going to be 8A times something. So let's do that and forget about the 8A. We'll group the first 2 terms, group the last 2 terms. A to the 5th and A to the 4th, they have an A to the 4th in common. And when I factor out an A to the 4th, I'd be left with A minus 1. I'm going to drop down A minus 9. And 9A and 9 have a 9 in common. And I should be left with an A minus 1. So these 2 groups have an A minus 1 in common. And I'm left with A to the 4th minus 9. Now what you need to do is you need to check your answers. And I'll kind of go back through and show you on the other ones why we couldn't do this. If you have an A squared or an A to the 4th, you need to check and see if you can factor that again. And it's always going to factor the same way with that plus and minus, okay? If you can fill this in, you need to factor it again. What times what gives you A to the 4th? A to the 2nd, yeah, A squared times A squared. Give me the 4th. What times what gives me? Negative 9. And negative 3 and a positive 3. So your answer would be 8A times A minus 1 times A squared minus 3 times A plus 3. Now to show you that the other ones wouldn't have been able to factor that way, if you look at this one, if I tried, and I was like, okay, well that's an m squared and a negative. What times what gives me 2m squared? Nothing, right? And there's nothing times itself that gives me 5. You can't factor that one again that way. Same thing here, it's a plus. If it's a plus, you can't factor that no matter what. This one is a minus, but there's nothing times itself that gives me 7x squared. Okay? Most of your problems are going to be like the first 4. But you will have a few, probably 3 or 4, where you either have to factor out a greatest common factor or factor it again when you think you have your answer.